In 1955, Chrysler separated Imperial and made it its own brand as an attempt to try to have Imperial compete more closely with Cadillac. Those first 1955 Imperials and the Imperials for a number of years would be extremely luxurious, high-quality Chryslers. And even though some years were kind of funky, let's say in particular the 1961 and 62 Imperials, well, by the late 1960s, it was time for an all-new Imperial and full-size Chryslers in general. And the 1969 Imperial was done in the fuselage style like the other full-size Chryslers of that model year, meaning that it had super clean body sides that emulated an aircraft fuselage. Now, after a few years, it was, of course, time for a refresh on the fuselage body Imperials, and here comes the 1972 Imperial. This particular style of Imperial was produced for the 1972 and 73 model years, aside from a few minor differences like the grille texture and the enormous bumper guards on the 1973 model due to bumper standards of the time. The 72 and 73 Imperials are pretty much identical. But when Chrysler was deciding what styling to introduce on the 1972, it had a choice to make. There were a number of proposals and alternate designs aside from the final version that you see here. So let's take a look at some of the proposals because they're pretty wonky, I must say. And here is the first one. This is a clay model in Chrysler's design studios. It's obviously about half finished, not fully complete yet. But this is pretty funky when you compare it to the 1972 production Imperial, which was also a rather radical design, especially in the luxury space. Remember, luxury buyers were quite conservative, older, wanted more traditional forms, traditional-looking cars. And the final 72 Imperial, I would say, was not that, nor is this that you see here. In particular, this is the only Imperial that would have had stacked headlamps. Imperials had single headlamps or quad headlamps that were horizontally oriented, but it looks like Chrysler's designers were thinking about going in a new direction on this Imperial. So you have those quad headlamps, and then you have a bifurcated grille that's got this, I guess, portion of the bumper that bisects it, dividing it into two, kind of what would become a Chevrolet hallmark on the early 70s Caprices, and then Chevrolet would reintroduce that more recently on cars like the Malibu. So a lot going on here. You do notice that the body side does have that fuselage style curvature, except it does have a pretty pronounced feature line running down the middle of it that breaks up that typical fuselage shape. And I'm not quite sure if I like that, or almost mentally imagine what this car would look like without that feature line there. I think it would look better, but perhaps the designers were trying to give some dimension to that body side. You also don't have much of a wheel arch at all. It's just integrated with the overall body side. Very clean styling. Take a look at those toothpick A-pillars. Could those get any thinner? Clearly not going to support the roof very well in the event of a rollover. You do have the hardtop styling. This is a hardtop coupe with the window that, as an example, goes down in the rear. And you also have the fuselage lengthy quarter panel out back and skirted rear fender. No lower moldings on this car yet. I suspect something is going on with the clay model, and those just haven't been put on at this point. So not quite sure how I feel about this proposal. Put a comment in the comment section. The front end kind of looks like an AMC Ambassador to me, but I guess maybe Chrysler designers got some inspiration from AMC. I don't know, but that's at least what it looks like. At least I think so. Again, let me know in the comment section. I should also point out that while clearly unfinished, this particular clay model appears to have two different proposals up front. You can see that dual stacked headlamp version on the driver's side. And the passenger side, not quite sure what's going on there, if they were intending to have hidden headlamps in the lower grille. But obviously the hood has a different shape, and then there's not that upper portion to the grille, and the fender has a different form as well. So not quite sure what was going to happen with that side of the car, but maybe this next photo will give you an idea, because I think the passenger side of this car is pretty close to the passenger side of the next photo that I'm going to show. And here we are. Again, this car has two different proposals, one on the driver's side, one on the passenger side. The driver's side is clearly a different proposal than what you just saw. But the passenger side appears similar. You have that grille, and I'm not sure where the headlamps are. They, I guess, are hidden in the grille somewhere in this proposal. And you've got a little bit of a Cadillac-y power dome hood with that boat shape at the front, the boat hull shape. And the fender is a really strange form. It just terminates so abruptly. It's somewhat Ford-like in that, but it's also rather chunky. That just goes all the way down. And the bumper doesn't really cover the portion of the car that is extending the most. The fender doesn't have any bumper around it. So that bumper was just purely decorative on this car. I think that might have been one of the reasons why this was shelved. Notice now you got a little wheel lip molding on this car. That center feature line is gone. It does look like there's some surfacing going on in the rear portion of the car, just based on how the light is breaking. You do still have those toothpick A-pillars, the hardtop glass, and the fuselage era style overall. Although the C-pillar is more formal, let's say, something that would be more akin to the next generation Imperial coupes. Of course, those were often outfitted with vinyl padding around them. Here, this is just a clean, slick top. So an interesting style from the proposal that you see here. Not much would make it through to production. Those wheel lip moldings are kind of similar, the wheel arches, but not much of the rest would make it through to production. And here, of course, is the final version of the 72 Imperial with what I think is the prettiest front end of all the ones that you saw, with the hidden headlamps, this very large, wide rectangle within a rectangle grille. And you have what General Motors, I believe, design vice president called a front end that looks like a back end, probably because of those large turn signals up front. My guess is that those turn signals took their inspiration from the old woodlight lamps, I believe they were called, from many years earlier than this. But again, this I think is the overall most handsome proposal of what you've seen, not only from the front, but the 72 Imperial also has this beautiful rear end styling. Let's take a look at that now. Now, by this point, Imperial and Chrysler were sharing quite a bit of sheet metal and roof panels. Hence, the Imperial had this cap that was placed over the backlight to give it this Frenched-in, more formal look for privacy purposes or pseudo-privacy purposes. But the rear end of this car, take a look at that quarter panel and the overall length. This is fuselage styling at its best. Clean, unbroken lines, just beautifully curving up into the roof panel and down toward the rockers. And they have this great detailing, the side marker lamp that has the Imperial eagle in it and the mid-century modern block lettering that spells out Imperial on the quarter panel, I think is just supremely elegant. Now, one thing that was different from the proposals that you saw, those actually had a decent-sized fender skirt. For whatever reason, the fender skirts on the final Imperial, as well as the Chrysler, are just diminutive. I don't even know why they made it. It's like a fender skirt that's about 2 inches tall. But you do have to take them off to get the tire off in some scenarios, unless you really jack up the car. I think even I had to take them off, if I recall correctly, even with the rear end fully jacked up on these. Thankfully, it's not too bad. They're just held in place by one wing nut. And of course, it wouldn't be an Imperial if you didn't have a gorgeous interior. And take a look at these gold leather seats. Now, the inspiration for these seat patterns was the Barcelona chair, and you can clearly see that in how these are designed. They are as comfortable as they look, I must say. The loose cushion design perhaps helps a little bit with that. And the door panels are not overly luxurious. That area with the armrest is actually hard plastic. The upper portion of the door panel is super soft touch, I will give it that. And you have the so-called casket handle door pull in order to close the door. Now, one interesting feature about the door panels is that there's a little pocket there at the back of the door panel that snaps to it. But if you undo the snap, you have a little area where you could stow different things like a map or some other items. That was something that Ford would have in later years, but it's pretty cool that this Imperial has it a number of years earlier. Unfortunately, the instrument panel was largely shared with the Chryslers of the era. The speedometer was the same, although you did get more gauges with the Imperial and a sentry signal that said check gauges, as if any of them read something that was alarming, like the fuel light was low, as an example. But you did get a temperature gauge, you got a charging, discharging gauge there off to the right, and of course you did get the fuel gauge. Now this particular car does have the tilt telescoping wheel, which I believe was sourced from General Motors at the time. And you do have the Auto Temp 2 system there above the radio. The Imperials did come with 3-speed wipers, and interestingly, on these cars, there's only 4 vents that are used for air conditioning. There's the 2 in the middle, and there's the 2 lower ones, and that's it. There are openings that you can rotate open in the floor area if you want a little bit of cooling to bleed through down there. But Chrysler, interestingly, on the next generation Imperial that would have 6 vents, would actually advertise that there were more vents than the competition. I guess they forgot, whatever reason, that on the previous generation Imperial, they only had 4 outlet vents, which was pretty typical for the time, although some other cars had more. And of course, under hood in your Imperial, you got Chrysler's top V8, the mighty 440, which wasn't so mighty for 1972. It was making 225 net horsepower, but a ton of torque, and it moves these Imperials along just fine. I find that the Chrysler products of this era do have good throttle response, good part throttle tip-in, I would say. And when you floor it, well, there's not a huge amount more, let's say, there. But the car moves. I mean, these are big, big vehicles. Actually, the 1973 Imperial would be the longest production non-limousine car that was made, and it's also unibody. So pretty interesting feat for a unibody. These cars do have unibody, and then they have a torsion bar front suspension, leaf spring rear suspension. That was just a Chrysler hallmark for a number of years. Chrysler loved their torsion bars up front, leaf springs in the back. The torsion bar is basically like an uncoiled spring, and I have to say that they did end up handling rather well, certainly when you compare them to the Ford vehicles of the era that were just wallowy and mushy overall. So I hope you enjoyed this spotlight on some design proposals for the 72 Imperial. What do you think of them compared to the final version? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.